Elder Floyd Rittenhouse, who at the time was the president of Andrews University, was tasked to write an obituary for a professor, a beloved professor who had died. This appeared in the Lake Union Herald in 1963, written by Elder Floyd Rittenhouse for Dr. T. Housel Jemison. And I want you to kind of note how this is strangely worded, especially for somebody as eloquent as Elder Rittenhouse. It's strange. It's, I guess, a little untracked. Because I spoke to a teacher that I had who was there at the time and a teacher at Andrews, Carl Kaufman, who told me that Dr. Jemison's death just truly shocked the community. It was as if an earthquake happened in Bering Springs. And I'm wondering if you can hear it in this obituary. He speaks of the dark Lincoln's birthday that they heard of his unexpected death. He mentions earlier that Dr. Jemison had to resign as department chair. He was department chair of the Department of Education. Just a few months earlier, he had to resign being department chair, but he still continued his teaching duties, okay, because of health concerns. And he listed his health problems. And here's where I'll begin to quote. Dr. Jemison's affliction was compounded by severe headaches, arthritis, and a most painful bone calcification of the feet. In spite of these severe handicaps, he insisted on carrying forward faithfully his duties until, without explanation or warning, he drove to his home on the campus where several hours later he was found dead. Something odd to put in an obituary, isn't it? The way that he worded that. And again, they were good friends. And I know that he is shocked, and I know that he's grieving and mourning, but still, to me, it's a strange way to word or something to put in his obituary. It gets even a little more strained. When the autopsy is performed, the exact cause of death will be known. That's what he put in his obituary. Interment arrangements are not complete this date, but it's expected that he will be buried in Washington, D.C. Doesn't sound like a regular obituary, does it? Doesn't even sound like a newspaper reporter wrote it. This is a dear friend who writes it. Then he goes on. Although this deplorable event removes from the faculty a gifted, competent, devoted teacher who will sorely be missed, the influence of his godly life and solid achievement will go on. 35 years later, when I was in undergrad at PUC, Dr. Jemison's book, A Prophet Among You, was still the textbook used, at least at PUC, and I know of 3 other programs, for our classes in Ellen White. You had to take 2 when I was at PUC. Okay? The Writings of Ellen G. White and The Life and Times of Ellen G. White. Dr. Jemison's book was a textbook in both of them that he had written 40 years earlier. Nobody had done a better job. So I know of this wide influence of T. Housel Jemison. In order that his host of former students, acquaintances, and friends may appreciate what Dr. Jemison accomplished, we give here a brief resume of his life and achievements. And they did. They listed his books, they listed his teaching posts, and everything that he had done for the church after that. The reason the language is said that horrible day when, with no warning, he drove home and several hours later, he was found dead. It's because he never made it out of his car from the garage. He drove into the garage, he closed the garage door, and he left the car running. He committed suicide. When Dr. Kaufman shared it with us, say 35 years later, that's not just, if he had just died, it would have rocked the community. Everybody loved him, but it was the way that he died. And that nobody, absolutely nobody, if you were to ask anybody who knew him, is there a possibility it would not be him? And I tell you, it rocked them so much that 30 years later, Elder Kaufman, who is as, how do you put it, Gary? You know Carl Kaufman? Yeah. He's as Adventist as you get. I guess that's the best way to put it. There are two people who I would list who have more fun and love being a Seventh-day Adventist more than any 5, 10 people I know. Carl Kaufman was one of them. Ralph Robertson's the other one. Just love being an Adventist. But he shared with us back then we had a deep-seated feeling that suicide was a line that couldn't be crossed. And that even Elder Kaufman, 35 years later, he said, that got us all to thinking about all of it. And for 1963, you have to imagine what it was like. In September of 2019, a pastor of the Inland Hills Church in Chino, California, died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Days after giving a self-confessing, unburdening sermon on his battle with depression and anxiety. In November of that year, Jared Wilson, a youth pastor and founder of a pioneering young adult mental health ministry, committed suicide just after officiating a funeral for a young woman who had taken her own life. He tweeted that morning, "Loving Jesus doesn't always cure suicidal thoughts. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure depression. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure PTSD. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure anxiety. But that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't offer us companionship and comfort. He always does that." This is the psalm that starts us off. "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the one who lifts my head." What we've been talking about is, we all agree if you are in Christ, as Gary has put us, that shield is ever over above you. It is impenetrable. It's a heavenly shield, though. It regards our heavenly citizenship, that we are now citizens in the kingdom of heaven just as surely as you are a citizen in the kingdom of the world. As long as Paul says, look at your feet. Are you standing on the ground? You are be as sure as you are standing on the ground here on earth that you are a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. This shield completely covers you spiritually. What we've been exploring is, what does that shield do for us here? Does it protect us temporally? We've talked about how it doesn't protect us necessarily from sickness or illness, getting old, dying, any of that. But what does it protect? What does it mean to us? And so I can't go on in this and talking about this and not talk about what this shield means to us then when we're talking about our mental health. We've talked about our physical health, but what about our mental health? What does the shield do when we're living on a planet that has so begun to batter our bodies, but also batter our hearts and our minds with trauma and assault and sickness and illness and death, PTSD, depression, anxiety, all of it? It doesn't. It doesn't protect us from that. And the one thing that we've attacked, remember we attacked it from day one, right, ladies? One thing that we've attacked doesn't mean that if you're sick here, that your shield cracked there. The church has the tendency to teach that if something's going wrong here with your feet on the ground, it means that God up there is not pleased with you. We're listening to the wrong voice if we believe that. So that's what we attacked. So another use of the shield, real quick just to share with you, the word shield is used 60 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, 18 times in Psalms alone, 18 times. David uses it 16 times, and out of the 16 times that David uses it, it's only an actual shield, a physical shield that his soldiers would use, or he would use once. Every other time, it's this shield right here. Every other time, it's how he feels God has shielded him. And so we've been exploring all the times that he's used it. Psalm 33:18, "Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope for his loving kindness, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in what? To keep them alive in famine. Whatever's happening temporally, David says, whatever is going on, hey, his eye is still on you. Doesn't feel like it, though, if you're in the middle of a famine, does it? But he says, he's not forgotten you. It may seem like it, especially if you associate all physically wrong with some sort of spiritual problem, but you don't even have to be off that deep end. Even those of us who feel that we kind of got it straight, that we're kind of living a balance, that maybe the spiritual shield doesn't take care of the temporal problems. When the temporal problem is bad enough, even we may feel that God has left us. It's not so. Faith that God is aware and ultimately concerned is what David is saying. Keep them alive in what? Even in famine, he says. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our what? And our shield. This is about the 8th time that he uses it. For our heart rejoices in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your loving kindness, O Lord, be upon us, according as we have hoped in you. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our what? And our shield. What about, as I've pointed out now, what about what's going on with us then mentally and emotionally as we what? As we wait. What are we waiting for? If nothing else, I'm waiting for lunch, but if nothing else, I'm waiting, please, Lord, today, if you can, right? But what we're thinking, what our emotions are, everything that makes up our emotional makeup has to be just as important and urgent as what's happening physically. And that knowledge has only come to us in the past, say, 20 years. Up until 20 years ago, everything that happened physically is what affected us mentally. No. It's the other way around. There's a great book. I haven't read it, but I trust people who have read it, who recommended it. You've heard of a book called The Body Keeps the Score? We'll talk about that just a little bit. We'll talk about that. But it's just in the last 20 or 30 years that we begin to understand the effect of mental health on our physical health. One of the things that attracted me the most when I first started my introduction to Adventism was the very first time that I ever went to watch Steve, our son, play, I think it was volleyball or basketball at Thunderbird. And I walked in there, and up there was that logo. Physical, mental, spiritual. That just turned me on. I just thought that was so cool. But what I noticed for the next 20 years my first 20 years in church, we were real good on the physical part. And we claimed to be real good on the spiritual part. And I think what had happened, and simply because of what research had told us and everything else, is that we believed that if everything was okay spiritually, and if we made everything okay physically, then the mental would take care of itself. It's not so. Not anymore. Well, it never was. It never was, and now we're finding that out. I guess is the way that I'll put it. So, I call on old friends to help us. There's this old friend I have. His name is Elijah. Elijah was called to ministry during one of the worst times temporally, physical kingdom here for Israel at all. It has one of the most deplorable kings on the throne in King Ahab. He's married to the daughter of the king of Sidon, the founder of a fertility cult. She's the priestess, the high priestess of a fertility cult, who is the sole sponsor of all the prophets of Baal in Israel. Okay? You want to talk about separation of church and state? There is none. Okay, she is the sole sponsor. Worship is coming from the throne. Ahab outlaws the worship of any god besides Baal, especially the living God of all Israel and Judah. First Kings tells of Elijah's ministry as one long string of successes, one after another. You want to share with kids what it looks like when God puts all of his weight right behind you and behind your ministry? You show them Elijah. Beginning in 1 Kings 17, he pronounces to Ahab a drought that will last for 3.5 years. And he's able to say this, no rain or even dew except by my word, I say so. In that drought, God cares for Elijah personally. He gives him the only private little brook in all of Israel to drink from. Ravens come each day to feed him. When that brook dries up, he sends him to Zarephath and has a widow, by the way, a widow who probably had nothing anyway before the famine. What does she have now? It's almost like God said, you know what? I'm going to perform a miracle, but I'm going to make it exponentially miracle-like. She has this, all of a sudden, endless supply of oil and flour to be able to feed Elijah and her son with. He raises the widow's son from the dead after he dies. Very first one. Takes him back to Ahab. Keeps Elijah from Ahab's death sentence. Ahab sends a death sentence for Elijah, and it's been out there for 3.5 years. And Elijah's been completely hidden. He has a showdown with the 450 prophets of Baal, by the way, the ones that Jezebel is all paying for. Asks fire to come down on his altar, and it does. And then he's able to kill them all. After 3.5 years, he says so, and it begins to rain. Outruns Ahab's chariots from Jezreel back with a head start. So if you were looking for temporal signs that God was with you, we've been talking in here that for us, usually, normally, not all the time, but normally, we want signs from God, and we look up to the heavens, and what do we get? Silence. God couldn't be louder with Elijah if he had a bullhorn walking around yelling it in his ear. When Ahab informs his wife that Elijah has killed all her prophets, she's pretty happy. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, sends it to him personally. Okay? So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like one of them by this time tomorrow. That's it. 3.5 years of God taking care of him, and this comes down. All right? If you were Elijah, what would you say? Psst. So what? For 3 years, there's not been one hiccup between me and God. Not one hint of whether or not God is listening to me, lady, in charge of carrying out this personal protection. I've got it. This is the brightest example of that shield covering both spiritual and temporal that we have ever seen. Bring it on, Jez. Oh, yeah. And if you don't think she had the power to do it, you'd think that that's the way Elijah would react. Is it? Then he was what? He was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. So he even leaves Israel again. Zarephath is up in the Gentile territory. It's Tyre and Sidon. He goes to pagan territory to outrun Ahab. This time he goes to Judah. He left his servant there. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, came and sat down under a solitary broom tree, and asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than what? I'm no better than my ancestors. That's how he reacts. Take away my life. Makes no sense, does it? If it were me, trying to prove the spiritual shield and the temporal shield, I'd stand over Elijah and say, God is your shield, Elijah, and you want to die? Most of us would kill to have the signs that your ministry in life is being so attended by the power of God. Most of the time, we look up at the sky and we just get silence. You unfaithful servant, just make up your mind. Those are exact words from a sermon that I heard a man preach. That's what he would have said to Elijah at that moment. But look what happens. Then he lay down under the broom tree and suddenly what? He fell asleep. Sometimes all you got. Sometimes all you got. Don't you like how Maury used to get us to get off the disciples' backs in Gethsemane? He says they were so traumatized by what was happening to Jesus, the only thing they could do was go to sleep. Suddenly an angel what? Suddenly an angel touched him. Exhausted to the point of doing nothing else, God sends an angel. Touches him, wakes him up, and says, get up and what? Get up and eat. Nothing wrong with sleeping. You need it. But you can't eat while you're asleep, so here's some food. No birds, no widow, an angel. God has stepped up his game, has he not? God's upped his game. He's given undisputed signs that he is still where? He's still with them. Even though Elijah, right? He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and immediately he does what? He lays back down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, get up and eat. Otherwise, the what? Journey. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you. He only wants to sleep. Angels prepping him for what? Prepping him for a journey. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food, 2 meals, 2 loaves or little pieces of bread and water. Bread and water. He gets up, and just the strength on that, he's able to travel for 40 days and 40 nights back almost to Egypt, to Mount Horeb. 40 days and 40 nights, he does it on 2 muffins and 2 jars of water. But notice Mount what? Mount Horeb. You know, I usually read in it and come across, and the first time that I was wanting to really do something about this and connect it to what we're talking about, I read it, and I actually got a whole verse ahead where I went, wait a minute, Mount Horeb? And I went, and it's like the scripture said, yeah, that one. Where Moses first found God. First time God brought a son of man into his actual presence. It's also the mountain where he gives water to Israel after they're out. This is the place. He's not there by accident, is he? At that place, he came to a cave. He spent the night there. Guess what? He goes right back to what? Right back to sleep. Then the word of the Lord came to him saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? And this is why I called this talk what I called it. What do you hear in that question? What are you doing here, Elijah? I hear Elijah's answer. What? You brought me here. But God's not asking about his geography, is he? He's not asking about his location, is he? What are you doing here, Elijah? I've heard some pastors treat this as a Jonah situation, that Elijah was actually running from God. And so that question is, what are you doing here? As if he's not in Nineveh, as if he's in Joppa, right? That's not what this is about. Let me help. What are you doing here, Elijah? How are you feeling, my son? because I know that that's what Elijah hears. Elijah hears, how are you feeling, my son? What are you doing here? It's because of his answer. I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. He feels he should be protected. I am very zealous. I should be safe. Yet I am alone. All evidence points otherwise. For the past 3.5 years, all the evidence points to otherwise. Elijah, I believe, is completely aware that everything he said right there isn't true. There's no evidence to what he said. There is evidence that God will protect him against this death warrant because he already protected him from 2 others, right? Evidence he's not alone. When he was running and he comes across Obadiah, Obadiah told him himself, I've got 100 prophets in the cave that I'm hiding from Ahab and keeping alive. It's easy for us to make a judgment. Right now, at this moment, it's easy for us to say, dude, you got no faith. You just got no faith. How can you not believe? How can you not believe? What a complete idiot. What a fool. Must not have been the guy of God that we thought you were. He still feels this way. So I want to share something with you. He's feeling sad, tearful, empty, and hopeless. He has outbursts, irritability of frustration, a loss of interest or pleasure in his normal activities, sleep disturbances, including insomnia or what? Sleeping too much. Tiredness and a lack of energy, so even small tasks take extra effort. Reduced appetite and weight loss, or increased cravings for food and weight what? Gain. He has trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, and remembering things. He doesn't remember anything God has done for him, or at least he doesn't apparently. I'll save these last 2 for last. Feelings of worthlessness, guilt, fixating on past failures or self-blame, frequent or recurrent thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, or suicide. Since he's not here, I then, who am not a therapist, am allowed, since he's not here, to at least say, I think he has clinical depression. Has nothing to do with his circumstances. Has nothing to do whether or not God is there, present or completely blessing or healing or not. What are you doing here, Elijah? How are you, my son? I'm alone and I want to die. So notice what God does then. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to what? He's about to do for him what he did for Moses. Moses said, show me your glory. He's about to do the same thing for Elijah. Reacts a bit differently, though. Elijah doesn't ask for it. There was a great wind so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. Or after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the what? Lord, not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a what? A sound. That's what it's translated. What did you guys almost finish it with? What do most English translations finish that with? A still, small voice. No. In Hebrew, this is what it sounds like. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. The Hebrew word is silence. Silence. Not a whisper, not a gentle blowing, but silence. Not the overwhelming power of omnipotence or even creation, but silence. Here in this kingdom, we look up and say, why, Lord? Why silence? You can do anything, God. You can overwhelm anything by force. You can make Elijah feel better. You can make me feel better. Why silence? And here just to tell you that every English translation has kind of shaved or made this smoother because they can't imagine that God can do anything if he's silent. But notice, fire, earthquake, wind, Elijah doesn't move. But once it goes silent, Elijah what? He heard it. He hears the what? He hears the silence. He wraps his face in his mantle and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a what? Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? How are you, my son?" Elijah tells the same story. You know, I just told you why I'm here. Tells the same story. God then tells them all his future for him. Now he tells all his future for him. Tells them that there's a new king coming. Tells them that there are 7,000 prophets that have not bowed their knees to Baal. You are not alone. And after this, Elijah gets up and he goes. By the way, Jezebel did not lift her death warrant. Nothing's changed. It's just now he's ready to go back. What are you doing here, Elijah? How are you, my son? Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our what? And our shield. So just some notes, and then I want to talk about us a little bit, okay? Just some notes. God does not overwhelm in his blessing. Note, all God's earthly blessing on Elijah figures in no way in his terror or his depression. It makes not one dent in his depression. Everything that God did for him, it could not penetrate his depression or his state of mind or his anxiety or whatever is going on with Elijah. It doesn't make it go away. God doesn't offer to make it go away. He's in the silence. What are you doing here? Tell me. And what's funny is that he even, when he gets them back out there, he even says, "Tell me again." And God doesn't go, "All right, you already told me that, man." He calls Elijah in his silence, he calls him into his lap first, and then tells him his future. Just one question. Is that how we try to comfort people? We don't, do we? We have a tendency to tell them their future. If you want to join me tomorrow, we're going to talk about grief. We're going to talk about how we can try to give comfort to people in grief. And this is one of the problems that we have. In the church, we have a tendency to tell people about their future hope and not let them grieve. We try to hope their grief away. But notice God didn't. He didn't yell at him while he was still sitting down there saying, "Come on, man, get something to eat. There's 7,000 prophets. You're not alone." No. He doesn't speak. He tells Elijah, "You know what? I'm going to listen to you. Come sit in my lap." Now, what are you doing here, Elijah? How are you, my son? Complete presence. You know how you know that somebody is completely present with you? That their mouth stopped moving. And I have to tell you, as a pastor, that is the most difficult thing. I make my presence known by talking. Pastors make lousy chaplains. They make horrible chaplains. They probably make horrible therapists. Why? Because we want to talk. We got words. We got hope. I'm going to tell you all about this hope. Hardest thing for a pastor to do is just shut up. God shuts up. Brings Elijah into his lap. By not talking, Elijah knows God is completely present. Completely present. I want to hear your story again. But nothing's changed. Why do you want to hear it again? Because it's yours, my son. I'm your father. I'm going to listen to you all day long. It's the silence that draws him out. It's the silence that God uses to open him up. It's one of my favorite psalms. The same guy that wrote about the shield wrote this psalm. I'll get back to that. But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, my soul is like the weaned child that is within me. Lord, I know exactly who you are. I know what you want from me. But right now, you know what I need? I just need to crawl into your lap. I need to tell you what's going on. God's saying, of course there's something wrong, my son. Of course there's something wrong. I'm listening. I'm giving you all that you need. Doesn't automatically cure. So think about how we conclude then, how we approach. I want to talk to two groups of people today. I want to talk to us. I want to talk to us, maybe thinking of friends, family, or loved ones who are suffering from depression or anxiety or any sort of mental health that so many people are walking around with. I want to speak to us, and then I want to talk to us personally. But let me give you one conclusion. The beautiful frailty of the human free will is in the midst of this world's terror, pain, and suffering. And I'm telling you that the most terrifying just might be mentally and emotionally. As Adventists, we have a lot of us working against us if we want to truly minister to people who are suffering from depression or anxiety disorder. A lot of things that are working against us. Because the things that are working against us, when we try to be empathetic and comforting, what we think is comforting may actually be doing exactly the opposite of how God treats Elijah. A lot of that contributes to the idea that everything we're assured of in this shield, again, what we've done is we've taken this shield, the Lord is a shield about me, made it my Adventism and said, if Adventism is done right, it cures everything. And I wake up every day and ask God to remind me that the church that I'm in is this. For you say, I have need of nothing. Why? Because I'm an Adventist and I do it right, and we have the end time message. And being remnant means that everything is right. Look at that shield. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Pastor Gary made a great point, a beautiful point, that Jesus saves, and then he says, follow me. Why is that path so narrow? Because we do not need him anymore. The only people that followed Christ, the only people that made the path wide and wide is people that needed him. The prophet tells us that we don't need anything. The belief that remnant means there's no need for anything except just to be good Adventists. Not just Adventists, by the way. I don't mean to pick on us. I can only speak from our own experience. But listening to other people, to other walks, other churches treat people who are depressed the same way. You're a Christian. Why are you depressed? But us specifically, just to speak us specifically, and I'm running out of time, so I hate to be this blunt, but the one thing that may be working against us the most here is the health message. Not the health message, but how we apply it and what we think it does for us. Diet, lifestyle, Sabbath rest. That makes such an invincible shield. That takes care of everything. Now, I'm speaking from a pastoral standpoint, okay? I can only speak to you from a pastoral standpoint. And I hope that you get the idea to understand that as a pastor, we're still members of the body. We don't live up here out alone. We are the body of Christ, right? We are family. But I'm just speaking from a particular standpoint. Gary and I go way back, but back in Northern California, and Gary, I know you were at this workers' meeting. It was my first workers' meeting. Okay, it was my very first workers' meeting. Every now and then the conference gets us together and does all that they can to try to lift us up and feed us and hopefully send us back a little less wounded than when we showed up. It's a time to get together. It's a time to be. It's a time for the conference to give you their agenda, to do everything. But and in Northern California, you had two. There was one in the winter and one in the summer, actually the beginning of the summer. And the summer one was designed to be a family retreat. You're supposed to bring your whole family, and they try to do activities for everybody. The winter retreat, it wasn't written that you couldn't bring your family, but normally our wives didn't come. Normally that was just us. So these two messages. This is a family retreat. And Don Snyder was our conference president. He brings in a professor from the public health department at Loma Linda. It's like I said, it's a family retreat, so most of us are in that meeting. I know my wife was in there. We're all sitting in that meeting. It's the first time in 1993 that I'd ever heard stats like this. First time ever. And one of the reasons is it's the first time ever we'd ever done research like this. And I want to note that one of the reasons why this was done, because unbeknownst to most of us, that in the previous 2 years, in Northern California, we had 5 pastors who needed bypasses. 5 pastors who had 2 double, 2 triple, and 1 quadruple bypass within the past 2 years. So as with other things, usually when the cost goes high enough, well, maybe we should do something about it. What the heck is going on, guys? Was kind of the attitude. Risk management had been putting out the alarm all over the North American division because it wasn't just happening in Northern, it was happening everywhere. It's costing big bucks. Do you know what it costs? You know what a double bypass costs you? When you're talking about the ones that are paying for it, not just us, but the ones that are paying for it, well, the alarm is out there. And Elder Snyder even actually told us, guys, I want you to listen to this guy because we don't know what else to do. He said, I've been doing this all my ministry, and this is the first time this has ever happened. So I kind of sat up. So 2 things that I'll always remember that professor shared with us, and it probably isn't so shocking now, but this is 1993. He said the first thing that we did, completely anonymously, we asked risk management if they would let us know what drugs are being prescribed for pastors. That's all they wanted to know. Do you know what the number 1 drug being prescribed for pastors across the North American division back then? Anything cardiogenic. Blood pressure medication, statins, alpha blockers, anything cardiogenic. Do you want to know what the number 1 prescription for their wives was? Anything psychotropic. And that was back in 1993 where basically there was like 2. But that was the number 1 prescription. Then he shared with us once that down at Loma Linda, he said there was a man that came to them that was referred to them by the emergency room. It sent him to the public health department because his cholesterol was in the high 400s. It's off the charts, man. He's a walking stroke. His blood pressure, his glucose, his triglycerides, it is off the charts. And he's young. They don't want anything to happen to this guy. So immediately they put him in a lifestyle readjustment, a desperate lifestyle readjustment. 90 days, raw foods and nuts. That's it. And the guy didn't cheat. He really, really wanted to do it. Didn't cheat one bit. Guess how much his cholesterol came down? It went up 1 point. It went up 1 point. So it was $4.96. It's now $4.97. Somebody finally said, "What do you do for a living?" Because all that was on his form was that he was a police officer. That's all they did to explore his lifestyle. All they did was look at his labs and say, "This is a diet problem." He said, "Oh, I'm an undercover narcotics officer." Where? South Central LA. Thank you, Siri. Appreciate it. Siri just heard that I asked where I was. Thank you, Siri. They pulled him back. They put him on a desk job, and in 30 days, his cholesterol was below 100. This is 93. Like I said, this is how recent that nobody was adding stress and anxiety to any sort of physical problems. There was no connection. Even us, even Loma Linda University was saying, this is a diet problem. Let's just change his diet. Physical, mental, spiritual. Take care of the spiritual, take care of the diet, and the mental will take care of itself. When I got back and I shared that statistic with my prayer meeting group, and I had a prayer meeting group that I was actually trying to get into. I came out of seminary thinking I was going to save the church because I thought small groups were the answer. So I was trying to get my church to get into more relational, intimate small groups, get to know each other. Maybe gender up some of this love and acceptance, and maybe not be condemning each other so much. And so we were doing that. I just happened to share those two statistics. My health leader, who, by the way, was a world-famous health leader, she traveled the world doing health seminars. Her first comment was, well, if pastors would just keep the health message, then this wouldn't be a problem. Her perception, traveling around the North American division, was that all pastors weren't even vegetarians, and that most of us were fat. That's how much of an impact this made. Everything can be solved with the health message. One of those bypasses was a pastor who was the head of my team at camp meeting. You remember Chet Shoemaker? He was about 1 year post-op from his bypass when I met him first. Okay? And there are conversations. We're just trying to get to know each other. And in between the work, we're trying to get to know each other. And one day he sat back and he said, "I'm so bewildered of even why I had to have this. I've been Adventist all my life. I have never eaten anything that is outside counsels on diets and foods." He goes, "I had no idea. What happened?" He said. He was slim. He was active. You couldn't shut him down. But a few days later, and I don't even know if he put it together. I really don't. A few days later, he was telling me that he had a group in his church who decided it was their mission to make sure that every word he said from the pulpit could be found approved by the spirit of prophecy. They didn't even sit in the sanctuary to listen. They sat in the fellowship hall because they had a table that had stacks of books by Ellen White, and every time he would come to a conclusion, they'd pull a book out to see if they could find where he received the authority from this. One time, he said, "I made a conclusion that was so egregious, I guess." He said that the guy didn't just make the point to me, he pinned me up against the refrigerator to do it. See, but he couldn't figure out why he needed a bypass. I made tapes for those worker meetings for you. By the way, I worked in tape ministry at camp meeting. When I got back to my church and I'd go to these workers meetings, pretty soon some people started asking us who worked in the tape department at camp meeting, "We'd like some tapes from our speakers at the workers meetings. Can you start making them for us?" And I said, "Sure." Just a matter of bringing a deck and plugging it into the sound system and recording. And then we had masters, and we were allowed to take equipment from camp meeting and everything else. The conference let us use the conference buying power to buy tapes. I said, "Sure, we'll do that." Average, when we had good speakers, Gary, we had a real good theologian, maybe 50 to 150 tapes I would make, and we would sell. In the 10 years that I did, actually 5 years, about 10 years. That's what's funny is from 1993, okay, it takes probably until about 2005 where people quit using tapes. Redwood went through this thing where people got mad when we quit using tapes, and people have been using CDs for like 5 years, but we're still making tapes. But anyway, 5 years apart, there was one meeting, okay? One meeting, these two meetings happened 5 years apart. Okay, it was a summer family meeting, and the keynote speaker of that family retreat was Dr. Archibald Hart, who at the time was the dean of the psychology department at Fuller Theological Seminary. He had dedicated most of his time there to studying the mental health of the pastoral family. So he came and he gave just riveting talks. They were absolutely riveting. Now, I will concede that it was held at a resort, okay? So yes, attendance was high. It was very high, okay? The conference sprung. We went to a resort because normally we'd stay at the dorm at PUC. We'd stay in the women's winning hall at PUC or at the dorm at Rio Lindo Academy. My wife quit going. Nellie quit going. She goes, I don't want to spend a week of my vacation time to sleep in a dorm. But we went to Canocti Resort in Lake County this time. And we all had rooms and everything, and boats, and to take boat rides, to ski on Clear Lake. And it was something. So yes, the attendance was high. But here's what I noticed. When we were done, I got an order for nearly 2,000 tapes. And most of the orders that were brought to me were brought to me by the pastor's wives. 5 years later, it's a pastor's retreat. It's not a family one. It's a winter one. Okay? It's a winter one. I wasn't making tapes then, but here's what happened, is that at Leone Meadows, which is our Northern California's retreat, it has lodges, very nice lodges, and then it has dorm rooms and places like that. The lodges are usually reserved for pastors. What we do is we sign up, they assign us another pastor as a roommate, or if we sign up in advance, I say, I'd like to room with Gary, and so they put us in there. By the time that we all began to try to reserve whether or not we were in a lodge room, they were completely booked by couples. Our main speaker, somebody who wanted to speak on depression. We had 10 times as many wives and families come to that one as we ever did a winter's meeting. I'm just sharing that with you. There's nothing scientific about this. There's no poll to this. I'm just sharing this with you overall. Mind, character, and personality is not a therapy. Just because you read mind, character, and personality, it's not therapy. It's not recovery. It's not counseling. By the way, no book is. There are thousands of books on the shelves in Amazon, thousands of books on the shelves at Barnes & Noble claiming they can cure your depression or your anxiety. My son's a clinical psychologist. He went to Fuller. One of the things that they said was, if you want to know whether or not a theory is worth pursuing to enter into your practice, find out if the guy wrote a book. If he wrote a book. Because it can't be done in a book. Now, that doesn't include textbooks. If you wrote a textbook, that's different. But if he wrote a book to sell on Amazon to try to convince people they could cure themselves by reading his book, that's pop psychology. Not even physical health can guarantee that our mental and emotional health. We could have perfect mental and emotional health. We've already said that shield, even complete good physical health, complete keepers of the health message. I've buried with cancer and heart attacks and strokes. You with me? That shield doesn't cover that. The health message doesn't cover that. In essence, Ellen White said that all mental illness can be attributed to sin, which I agree with. But she's talking about sin, capital S. Sin is a problem throughout the entire thing. Our personal sins may or may not have anything to do with our mental health. It had nothing to do with Elijah's. So, to talk about this, to take a first step then before we talk tomorrow about trying to give compassion, I think that where we start is that we believe what we've been taught by Gary and by Eddie today. We are complete and whole in Christ first. That spiritual shield makes you complete and whole in Christ. So you know what? I don't then have to go fix everybody. I don't feel a compunction to have to go fix somebody because I don't have a spiritual hole in myself that I'm trying to fill by doing good works by helping you. With me? Because a lot of what we do when we're trying to help and comfort people in grief is about us. It's about me and not you. I come in talking. I come in fixing. Have to say something. Have to help them along. Give them a verse. Give them a brand new Bible study. Give them a new devotional book. Give them a recipe for charcoal treatment twice a day. You know, when you do that with somebody who has cancer, you know what you're telling them? This was your fault. You can keep the health message. We'll talk about that a little tomorrow. So real quick, I shared this on Monday. A psychologist named Paul Vance says this. He says, we build up a false self. The outer defense edges we share with the world. In that gap between the real you and the person that you were put out there for self-defense reasons is the place where all of our issues lie. We inflate ourselves in defense by puffing up ourselves to deal with real or perceived attack. The more we do, the more we lose touch with our real self. The only way to fight this is to deflate the defense. Instead of puffing up, we need to know we are weak and know nothing. Jesus always defended himself with no gap between his true self and false self. Attack this by having places to be real. The more we do, the more our defenses we use will be made more appropriate for the situation. If we don't, there'll be a point when we completely lose interest in nurturing. What we've been called to do will be completely replaced by our inflated defense of the false self. We will lose all interest in heaven, knowing that in heaven, nurture is all there is. This is a bottomless pit. What he's saying is that my false self, when I puff up a mask, I need you to know that I'm holy. I need the church to know that I'm holy, because if I'm not, I won't be saved. And by the way, the church then taught me I need to save other people. So if I don't save you, I'm not going to be saved either. So I bring that hole, I bring that emptiness into a situation where I'm trying to give you comfort. So I am compelled then to tell you what to do. I'm compelled then to fix you. And it's all about me. Because I have no place to be real. I don't have a place where I can take this mask off. In recovery, we say you can trust the least trustworthy person in the room. And when you're sitting in the middle of church or Sabbath school, you don't know who that is. So we're either completely silent in Sabbath school, or we actually only tell you about my victories. We don't talk about defeats in church, do we? I'm glad to point to the sky when I hit a home run. I don't do it when I strike out. We wear masks to defend ourselves. The more we live, the more elaborate the mask becomes. It gets to the point to where the energy put forth holding up the mask exhausts and weakens us. This is when I feel that my church begins to contribute to the depression and the anxiety rather than trying to help with it. We force people to put on masks and keep them elaborate. Pretty soon it becomes exhausting. Exhausting spiritually, exhausted physically, exhausting mentally. A toxic church can cause more trauma than a whole team of terrorists. Mostly, the biggest lie, I believe, is that no one else can be as big a sinner as me, and that I can't be forgiven. There's a leading cause in these disorders. I wrote this, that in the 20th even though we were unaware of it. But in the 20th and the 21st century, depression and anxiety disorder just might be our great plague. Dr. Vance says we need places to be real, groups of sharing, confidentiality, accountability, disclosure, places where sinners can be brought out of their isolation, join allies to bring down the masks, and to find rest. We were created to do this together. I know I'm over, but do you mind just one more conclusion, just real quick? Philip Yancey tells of a friend who introduced him to his midnight church. He was having coffee with this friend who's a recovering alcoholic. The midnight church he is talking about is his AA meeting. They don't talk about the right things in church, he tells Mr. Yancey. We don't talk about our weaknesses in church. What AA has done is teach me one thing: dependency. I can't make it on my own. Isn't that why Jesus had to come? He's asking him this as a believer. Most church people give off a sense of piety and self-confidence. They don't appear to be dependent on God or on each other. Their lives appear to be in order. An alcoholic who goes to church either feels inferior or incomplete. Why? Because there's no one else there who can be honest about their weaknesses. It's a funny thing. There's a line that just kills me. And I didn't even realize what it meant until I got into recovery. It's a funny thing. What I hate most about myself, which, by the way, is usually what we hate most about them too, is my alcoholism. What I hate most about myself is my alcoholism. Yet it's the one thing that God used to bring me back to Him. I know I can't survive without God. I need Him to get me through each and every day. Maybe that's the redeeming value of alcoholism. Maybe God is calling us alcoholics to teach the saints what it means to be dependent on Him and on a community. He said, my church attendance and everything that I do in church, God didn't use any of that. He didn't even use my attempts to quit drinking. He used the disease itself. The one thing I hate most about myself, that's what God said. That's when God shut up, silent, opened the door and let him in. The founder of AA, Bill W., was a successful businessman and salesman. After months of sobriety, he was in Kansas City where a big deal had just fallen through. The anxiety of losing this deal hit him hard, and the temptation was overwhelming. He said to himself, I need a drink, and he headed immediately to the hotel bar. As the bartender was mixing his drink, he looked across the lobby and saw a payphone, and a thought came to him. I don't need a drink. I need another alcoholic. And he went to the phone and he called one. This is how AA was born. I don't need to be strong. I need another weakling. I don't need to sin. I need another sinner to talk to. I need to know I'm not alone. When you're depressed, you need to know you're not alone. I need to know I don't fight alone. I need to be honest and open so I can confess and be made clean. What are you doing here, Elijah? My son, how are you? So that's for us who are trying to help. Right now, I want to just speak to us right now. That list that I had up there earlier, feelings of sadness, tearfulness, emptiness, hopelessness, outbursts, irritability, frustration, loss of interest or pleasure in his normal activities, sleep disturbances, insomnia or sleeping too much, tiredness, lack of energy, even small tasks take extra effort. By the way, since COVID, that's me. I can't concentrate. Reduced appetite, weight loss or increased cravings, food or weight gain, trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, remembering things, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, fixating on past failures or self-blame, frequent or recurrent thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts or suicide. If you have experienced 3 of those or more for 10 days straight, go talk to somebody. you could be clinically depressed. And if you're trying to pray it away, if you're trying to study it away, or if you're trying to vegan it away, something may happen. 1 out of 10 people, if you're in a crowd, 1 out of 10, well, it's 20 actually. 1 out of 20 people are so depressed that if something doesn't happen drastically within the next 5 days, they might do something desperate. So next time you're in a crowd of more than 20 people, start looking around, start counting. That means in the pavilion tonight, there could be at least 40 people. In here, there's at least a couple of us. You with me? Go talk to somebody. Find somebody. And let me give you this. Don't let anyone tell you, again, that they could be prayed away or Bible read away. Hey, by the way, don't quit praying and don't quit reading your Bible and don't quit being a vegan because it isn't going to help. It may not cure, but it isn't going to help, okay? And don't let the church tell you that the medicines you might be described are for those who lack faith or for those who aren't keeping the health message. Don't let the church tell you that. Dr. Hart gave us 3 things when he spoke to us. He said, the antidepressants are meant to get you out of bed. And once they get you out of bed, I want you to exercise and I want you to come to therapy. And he said, you're not going to be able to do it without antidepressants. Church, we need to do better. We need to resource ministries. We need to quit belittling recovery groups. And we need to quit getting it in our heads that recovery groups are only for addicts and alcoholics. We need to quit demonizing them. If a recovery group wants to use your church, let them. I don't care what they are. Celebrate Recovery, AA, Al-Anon, Journey to Wholeness, the Adventist Recovery Ministry. Let the church do it. Resource it. It's for everybody. Any of them. Not one of them is for everybody, but any of them could be for everybody. If you really want to be more compassionate, then first of all, be assured of your own righteousness and your grace in Christ, and take a couple of classes in chaplaincy if you want to. Chaplaincy, a couple of classes. Most community colleges offer that. Have your pastor do a class in visitation. Have your pastor talk about it, do a class. Have a chaplain come in and do a quick seminar, if you will, on how to speak to somebody who might be depressed. And also grief. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. I'll leave you with this. A redemptive community, the true bride, by the way, looks at the pain and hurt and ugliness caused by evil and says to someone, you've come to the right place. How'd you like to be able to, for your church, to be able to look at somebody hurting and go, you've come to the right place. We know what to do. You can be part of a family that never ends. The bond can start with me. If you'll be and have my God be your God, then my people will be your people. And together we will fear no evil, for God is with us. Thanks for the extra time, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here today. Tomorrow, we'll talk about grief. The next huge plague of the 21st century. Let me pray with you. Thank you, Father, for bringing us together today. Thank you for reminding us of who you are and who we are. And just help us, Lord. As our head is lifted and we proclaim you our shield, help our feet below. Put one foot in front of the other. Help us grow into the children you would have us be. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Have a great lunch. See you at 6:30 tonight for praise. And then at about 7:15 or so, Eddie will continue to bless us.